In late August 2025, the United States sent numerous warships to the South Caribbean near the coast of Venezuela, officially to combat the smuggling of narcotics into the US by Venezuelan cartels. However, there are growing concerns that the US is actually building up military assets in the region to eventually bring about regime change in the country by ousting its current leader, Nicolás Maduro. This possibility is further reinforced by the fact that the US recently doubled the bounty on Maduro, who they accuse is playing an active role in supporting the cartels. And in early September 2025, the situation got really tense after the US conducted a missile strike on an alleged cartel boat smuggling narcotics. In response, Venezuela flew 2 fighter jets near a US Navy vessel, after which the US threatened to destroy any Venezuelan military asset that came too close to its navy. Now, this has become a dangerous situation for the region, so let's unpack what's really going on here and what it could mean for the geopolitical situation in South America. This is the Geopolitics Snapshot, and I'm your host, Politics with Paint. Now, before we jump in, just some really quick background information. As you might already know, the relationship between the US and Venezuela has been really bad for years, but how did we get here? Well, it mostly started in 1999 when Hugo Chavez won the presidential election in Venezuela. Under his rule, the country was transformed through what he called the Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez rewrote the constitution, centralized power in the hands of the president, which was him, and implemented a state-led economic system that, amongst other things, expropriated many foreign-owned economic projects, which of course was detrimental to the presence of US companies in the country. He also completely flipped Venezuela's political relationship with the US by opposing US influence in the region, which he deemed imperialistic. Step by step, any military and diplomatic cooperation between them was cut, and Venezuela started aligning itself with US rivals, most notably with China and Russia. When Chavez died in 2013, this trend intensified under his successor, Nicolás Maduro, who continued to centralize power in his hands. The Obama administration accused Maduro of suffocating Venezuela's democracy and implemented targeted sanctions against certain Venezuelan politicians. The animosity only grew when the Trump administration took over. Between 2017 and 2021, Trump adopted a maximum pressure approach to Venezuela, which included broad economic sanctions against its oil trade and financial sector, which further crippled Venezuela's already suffering economy. Then, in 2018, Venezuela held elections, after which Maduro declared victory but was accused of voter fraud. In early 2019, his opponent, opposition leader Juan Guaidó, declared himself the interim president, which the Trump administration recognized. However, Maduro remained in control of the Venezuelan state, and his forces cracked down on any protests or opposition, accusing the US of trying to instigate an insurrection. During the Biden administration, the US tried to change its approach and implemented some soft sanction relief. In exchange, Maduro promised to hold a free election in 2024. However, this election went similarly to the previous one. Both sides declared victory. The US and its partners said the true winner was the opposition, while ultimately Maduro remained in force and cracked down on protests. And so, US sanctions kicked back into force. Another point of contention was the Venezuela-Guyana crisis. Now, this is a story for another time, but basically Venezuela claims more than half of Guyana as Venezuelan territory, and for a time there was a fear that Venezuela could invade Guyana. The US unsurprisingly supported Guyana, but this topic deserves a video on its own. Then came the second Trump administration. Oh, wrong image. Ah, there we go. In 2025, they tightened the screws once again. First, the US doubled its reward for information or actions leading to Maduro's arrests to $50 million, a step that is probably aimed at destabilizing Maduro's government by making him more paranoid about a potential betrayal. And secondly, the Trump administration designated Venezuelan-linked cartels and drug smuggling networks as foreign terrorist organizations. And that is a really big deal, because normally drug traffickers would need to be prosecuted through the regular process required by the justice system, which includes court hearings and sentencing by a legal court. But by classifying them as foreign terrorists, the Trump administration argues that they are justified to use lethal military force under presidential self-defense authority, which legally is highly controversial and being contested right now. Regardless of that whole debate, in late August 2025, a US naval task group that included several destroyers took up station in the international waters near Venezuela, and in early September they carried out a lethal strike on a speedboat that allegedly departed Venezuela with drugs and was manned by members of a cartel. As a result, up to 11 people were killed. This was the first strike of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, and reactions to it, as you can see in this exchange on X. Proponents called it a necessary step to keep the US safe, while opponents called it an unjustified overreaction that basically amounts to a war crime. The Venezuelan government also called it an extrajudicial execution, and in response, it sent 2 F-16 fighter jets to perform a low pass near a US Navy vessel. The US then blasted the maneuver as highly provocative and threatened to shoot down any Venezuelan jet that came too close to its ships. Additionally, the US moved even more fighter jets to Puerto Rico to reinforce the US mission. For the Caribbean, that's a serious step up for the US military presence, which on paper is still only there to stop narcotics from moving into the US. However, there's obviously another angle to this, because the US government also claims that the Venezuelan government is directly involved with these cartels. Now, how true these accusations really are is up to debate, but they do give the US a possible justification to conduct military actions against the Venezuelan state itself, thereby facilitating regime change. To be fair, the US forces currently present in the South Caribbean are too small to seriously conduct such an operation, but we have to keep in mind that the situation here is geographically different from what we are used to. In the last few decades, most US military interventions were conducted in regions far away from the US mainland, like the Middle East, which required significant logistical preparation that took weeks or months even. Venezuela, however, is relatively close, especially if you consider that the US has a significant military footprint in the Caribbean, most notably in Puerto Rico and in Guantanamo Bay on Cuba. By the way, if you wonder why the US has a base on Cuba, although the Cubans want them out, here's a video I made about this some time ago, be sure to check it out later. Anyways, the entire situation is more than enough to make the Venezuelan government very nervous, and if the US continues to regularly blow up boats with Venezuelan nationals on them, it will put Maduro's government into a serious dilemma. If it doesn't react, it loses legitimacy and will increasingly be seen as weak by the Venezuelan public. And if it does react, it risks giving the US enough of a justification to actually conduct a large-scale military intervention. So how is Venezuela responding now? Well, with a mix of everything. On the one hand, it rejects the trafficking allegations and frames the US deployment as a pretext for an invasion. Therefore, Maduro has put the Venezuelan military on alert and moved troops towards key coastlines and borders to signal military strength. It has also filed complaints at the United Nations, arguing the US is violating the charter. At the same time, Maduro is also trying to charm Trump, which has become a popular strategy for many world leaders. He called him an intelligent and bold man and argued that certain elements of his administration are trying to push him to war with Venezuela for their own gain, thereby diminishing his chances for a Nobel Peace Prize, which Trump really wants. And he has also signaled readiness for renewed negotiations. But it's not only Venezuela that is worried. Several Latin American countries like Cuba, Nicaragua and Colombia have denounced the buildup, while Brazil and Mexico are worried about the precedent the US actions are setting. Mexico in particular is put in a difficult situation here. For decades the country has been plagued by powerful cartels, and the US could decide that Mexico is next to experience military interventions either with or without Mexican approval. But back to the topic at hand, will we see regime change in Venezuela? So far, the Trump administration has sent mixed messages, as it always does. Nonetheless, the US mission continues, and as I said, this puts the Maduro government in a serious dilemma, and any slightly miscalculated response by Venezuela, like again sending fighter jets too close to US ships, could trigger a serious incident that could escalate the situation. And while Maduro has signaled his readiness to negotiate, the track record of US-Venezuelan talks has been remarkably poor. But even if Maduro and the US are able to keep their heads cool, there is always the possibility that the targeted cartels could attack US forces on their own or commit revenge attacks on US soil, which could then escalate the situation anyways. And if a US military intervention in Venezuela really happens at some point, it will have a significant impact on the geopolitics of the entire Western Hemisphere. For one, it could basically cement the president's self-defense authority as a new tool for the US government to intervene outside of what we might consider classical counterterrorism. That is, if US courts uphold the Trump administration's view that their actions in the Caribbean were legal. For another, it means that the US will no longer shy away from actively shaping the political landscape of Central and South America through force. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the US did so regularly across the Western Hemisphere in pursuit of what is known as the Monroe Doctrine, which aimed to establish the United States as the sole dominant power of the American continents. During the Cold War, the US was regularly involved in influencing elections and toppling unfriendly governments to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining influence here, but it took a much more relaxed approach to the region after the Cold War ended. Now it seems that the US is reviving its old strategy in order to prevent rivals like Russia or China from gaining too much influence in the Americas. China in particular has expanded its influence across South America in recent years, and Brazil, as the most powerful country in the region, has pursued a geopolitical strategy that seeks to make it politically and economically more independent from the US. If you want to learn more about Brazil's relationship with China, I also made a video about that. Now, the standoff in the Caribbean is still young, and it's too early to say where the wind is blowing, but be assured I'll keep you updated. A big thank you to all my patrons and channel members, and here are a few videos that you might find interesting. Why not check them out? Until next time.